I will now like to call our next speaker, Professor Alon Tal, the head of public policy here in Tel Aviv University. And let's try and get up your talk. Okay.
So, again, welcome for those who have been late arrivals. Welcome to the Department of Public Policy. I don't know if we can get that buzz out in the background. That'd be good. My name's Alon Tal, and I'm the chairman of the department here, and really so honored to have such a distinguished group here and connected to us. Unfortunately, Dr. Chilit Katz from the law school was found out yesterday that she would be unable to attend. And so I was asked to come and essentially pinch hit and say a few words about cell phone regulation. It is not an area of personal expertise, and certainly speaking before Stilian, who is in the thick of things, is a daunting task. So I thought I'd just give you some general numbers for the international guests and those who are listening internationally. Can we do something about the feedback? Deborah, if you're listening, mute your microphone.
Okay.
We'll hear back from you later. Thank you. So I'll just give you some general context for people who aren't so familiar with Israel, and in fact for Israelis who may not understand, and talk a little bit about the Israeli regulatory system, and hopefully do my part to get us back on schedule. So, first of all, we should recognize that Israel is an intense user of cell phones. We looked at, this is the relative rates. Israel is just behind France, but when you compare it to a country like Belgium or Italy, we are significantly higher in the rate of cell phone use. According to an article that appeared a couple years ago in Globes, 90% of Israelis use their smartphones 7.4 hours per day. So obviously this is not people who are talking on the phone, but as a means of communication. And we all know, if you look at the end of the day, how many hours you can check on your smartphone, it's always a shock to me when I find out that I was looking at it for 2 hours or 3 hours or even 4 hours if it's an intense day. So Israelis of all walks of life are using cell phones all the time. Deborah expressed great concern for children, and of course children are receiving cell phones, and here I just thought I'd show us I just thought this particular slide would give us a sense of, throughout the ages, how Israelis grow up now, and children throughout the world grow up with their cell phones as an integral part of their way of interacting with their peers and with each other and entertaining themselves and the like. If you take a look at the use of mobile phone and internet, which is something which didn't exist maybe even 6 or 7 years ago for a lot of people, you can see the steady rise, 6.8 million users of the internet via their cell phones in Israel expected. Now, one of the reasons is that we're such champions in the cell phones is that it's so inexpensive in Israel. And there's no individual with whom this reduced rate of cell phone usage is associated with more than Moshe Kachlon, our Minister of Finance, who became a hero, so to speak, of Israeli consumers by his role when he was Minister of Communications, and really led what is taught now in business schools and economic schools, a massive deregulation campaign to lower cell phones. And really it catapulted him to stardom within the Likud party at the time. I mentioned to my friend Ophir Penis, a former minister himself, that I think if we were going to map the rise and fall of the cell phone deregulation champion this last week, some very, very embarrassing SMS messages from Minister Kachlon were published and probably took him out of politics for a little while there. So it was sort of, you live by the cell phone and you die by the cell phone. But I just wanted to share just sort of some of what happened in that amazing case study. In 2005, Israel took the first steps to sort of break what at the time was a very, very expensive cell phone policy. It said, first thing, that people could leave companies and would still be able to retain their cell phone numbers, because so many people were afraid to leave a company and were held hostages, because if they switched their phone number, all of their business contacts or family contacts would be lost, or it would be an incredible nuisance to get them back. And so the government said, if you leave a company, you get to keep your number. For many years before that, every single 051, 052, 053 was associated with a particular company, no longer the case. Then in September 2010, a very important stage was made when it was ruled that when you're calling another company, there has to be a single rate. At the time, before that, if I had say a Cellphone phone, and when I was calling a Pelephone phone, it could be very, very expensive. And they said, no, we have to have this unified, and that was highly regulated. And that was also something which drastically reduced the cost of cell phone usage for Israelis. In January, I see all these people nodding their heads, remembering when that happened and how happy it made them. In 2011, basically, in the past, once you joined a cell phone company, you were sort of locked in. And if you ever left, you had to pay a huge amount of penalties. And they would make it so expensive that nobody ever could leave. And so the government regulator said, no. If you have a contract with a company, say to come in for a year or two, and you leave, you only have to pay 8% of your monthly bill, not the entire monthly bill, or sometimes more, as a penalty was being charged, something which made it cheaper to leave. And all of a sudden, competition became something that was realistic and not just a mirage. And then later on, when people left for cell phone companies, they could spread out the penalty payment. They didn't have to pay it all in one shot. Again, giving the consumers the flexibility to really compete and play one user off the other. And then the ban on usages. But the real dramatic decision that changed the way we look at cell phones in Israel happened in 2010, Government Decision 2022, which was called Increasing Competition in the Cellular Branch for the Good of the Consumer, where it was ruled that new companies that wanted to enter the Israeli cell phone market were allowed to use the infrastructure and the antennas and the base stations of existing solar companies. And by 2013, 2 new service providers had came in, 3 more, and all of a sudden we had a very robust competition going on, and competition does what it does. It drove prices down dramatically, and so all of a sudden Israel went from being a very expensive place to have a cell phone to a very inexpensive place to have it. And here's some numbers that give you a sense of just how much the price has dropped. And in general, around the world, we saw the price of cell phones themselves drop. She mentioned the $3,900, which would be $9,000 today, and now we know an inexpensive smartphone can be purchased for several $100s. So really there's been a transformation in the cost effectiveness or the cost associated. Also, we've seen something in terms of cell phones use as an internet provider where the speeds are going up, but the data costs have been dropping. And this is just recent numbers in Israel, and you can see really a 7-fold drop in the cost while you're getting better and better service. So it makes sense if you want to be connected to internet to use this as well. Now, it's not that the cell phone companies haven't suffered as a result of this competition. And here you can see a drop in their revenues. That's the left side of your screen in terms of billions of shekels. And you can see that they're making far less money than they used to make. Maybe that's why they brought in the former head of the Labor Party to take over at Cellcom. Anyway, if you take a look at the result of this competition, take a look at how well Israel's doing, except perhaps for India, we would be probably the cheapest mobile provider in the world in terms of our rates. Okay, so this is, if you want a case study for deregulation, end of monopolies, breaking antitrust, and this kind of thing, Israel is a poster child in terms of the cellular market. Now, the second brief part of my presentation, I wanted to sort of run through some of the different players, and I'm trusting on Stillian that he can correct me now or when he talks if I should get something wrong, but you can only believe what you read on the internet so much, and laws. But I wanted sort of to go through some of the different players, as Stillian will take us into more details, just to give you a broad stroke of who's out there and who's doing what in the government about this. So the Ministry of Environmental Protection from 2006, ever since the law of non-ionizing radiation was passed in 2006, has been, I think, the central player in regulating cell phones to some extent. The Noise and Radiation Department, whose director we are honored to have with us, is authorized to issue permits and establish and operate radiation sources, which includes cell phone systems. And they can only, and this is only to be done after specified radiation levels are not exceeded, at least according to the website. The precautionary principle is one of the concepts which directs regulatory policy in this regard. And then they call this in the justification principle, at least online they call it that, which is that any increase in health costs or public health costs should be justified by tremendous benefits. And that means that the applicant has to come with a range of licenses and show that in terms of the planning department and show the professional competence to run this as well. Amongst the health areas, they have to show maximum human exposure levels and precautionary measures to prevent exposure to everything they possibly can. Anyway, the ministry is responsible for oversight and continued monitoring of the cell phone companies. I'm sure that Stillian will tell us about his dozens of inspectors who are out there inspecting on his behalf and the hundreds of Ministry of Environment employees who are helping him to do this very, very daunting task. Ministry of Environment, we all know, is one of Israel's most underfunded and anemic in terms of its budget. High-quality professionals working there, but really, really understaffed, and that's a serious question. The Ministry of Health largely has a role as an advisor. For example, when the Ministry of Education decided to set its standard for Wi-Fi in the classrooms, they had to first go through the process of conferring with the Ministry of Education. And again, before we set new levels, they have to be involved, and it doesn't seem they're as active as they might be. But for example, the ministry published recommendations for cellular distance phones from the body. Those are, of course, recommendations. They're not any kind of a standard. The Israel Planning Authority has put through National Master Plan 36A, which creates a national map for and zoning for small broadcasting facilities, including boosters and cell phone antennas. And this is allowed, in terms of their declared objective of the national plan, to allow for cellular signals to reach every corner of the country while preventing radiation hazards and with minimal environmental and landscape damage, added on as an afterthought. I say this because last week I think there was a big story in Ynet talking about the scandal associated with several communities relatively remote, which literally did not have cell phone coverage, and what a great disadvantage that was for them. And I can tell you, I mentioned my daughter once, she's a star here today, but when she is planning to go to her new base on the Egyptian border, she's very, very concerned that she'll be moved not to Yot Fatah, but the one afterwards, because there she has to walk a kilometer outside the base to get some kind of a basic cell phone signal so she can talk with her boyfriend and maybe her father once in a while. So this is something which is really associated with quality of life, and having a strong cell phone signal is even a factor in the value of property in Israel. The Ministry of Economics has a role in terms of protecting consumers in the actual purchase of cell phones. Okay, we have consumer protection regulations, and therefore we have a rule from 2002 that in every cell phone you buy, you have to have the warnings and the directives about what that should be. I don't know has anybody read that material? Maybe this is not exactly a normal sample, but I certainly have never read that.
This is something I did. No.
Oh, really? No, you should have made him click onto a movie or something.
No, wait, I did it in the year 2000,
Okay.
19 years ago.
Presumably then the cell phones then had even more radiation than they have today. Anyway, at least the sales sites, when you go buy them, are required to maintain real-time information about the health hazards associated with different kind of cell phone types, so that a consumer can decide if they want to buy a particular cell phone, whether they can reduce their exposures to the extent possible. And last but not least, the Israel Standards Institute, which is just down the street from us. It's a regulatory agency with a statutory authorization to set standards for consumer products, including those that emit radiation, and that includes cell phones, of course. It has laboratories that evaluate the performance of every cell phone type prior to its approval of their sales. So we have that as a prototype, but as Deborah said, we don't actually test the cell phones themselves. And so as we go into our workshop, I guess we need to ask ourselves here, well, is the present Israeli regulation of cell phones and their exposures enough? And what we do have, even if it's enough, is it actually being implemented? Is it working? Does the public have the protection it deserves and needs to reduce the health risks associated with cell phone usage? So that's my very general opening, and that's what I could do in an hour or two on the train this morning. And we're really delighted to have you. And now we'll have somebody who really knows what he's talking about, I guess. Stillian, you're welcome. Paul, you want to introduce him? Or,
Thank you very much.